Okay, I'm going to be doing this. I don't know how many of you are sitting in an actual physical room together, how many of you are watching this on computer, but welcome to all. As for me, I am Judy Klitsner. I am sitting in an Airbnb in Copenhagen. So that's just the way of the world these days. Here's the thing, you may note, just a procedural point. I've been asked to just present, which is not my ideal way of teaching Torah. I would love for this to be much more interactive. But here's how we're going to do this. I'm just going to present together with my PowerPoint, which I hope you can all see on your screen. And when I'm finished, I'm going to leave some time at the end for some questions and answers or discussion. So please, if you don't mind, keep yourselves muted throughout the presentation and do keep note of whatever questions you might have, and I'd be happy to discuss at the end. The only other procedural point is that you may notice that the title that I have given this shiur has changed from the one that was publicized. Somehow this caught my fancy a little bit more than Daughters of the Israelite Revolution. I called it Imposter Syndrome and Other Challenges to Personal and National Identity, from the Daughters of Egypt to the Daughters of Zelophehad. Believe it or not, that is the same shiur, and I will illustrate that in a moment. What is imposter syndrome? This is something that has intrigued me for some time now. Let's start with this woman, the Oscar-winning actress Jodie Foster. After she won her Academy Award for her performance in the movie Silence of the Lambs, she says this: "I thought everybody would find out and they'd take the Oscar back. They'd come to my house knocking on the door. Excuse me, we meant to give that to someone else." That's Jodie Foster. This syndrome, imposter syndrome, was named in 1978. People feeling that everybody knows something that they don't know, everyone else is the real thing, and only I am an imposter. And recent studies have shown that more than 70% of us suffer from this syndrome, and we find that more than that, up to 75% of executive level women, and the numbers seem to be growing all the time. And some people trace this syndrome back to the theories of the great 20th century psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott, who introduced the world to the concepts of the true self and the false self. And as a disclaimer, I'm not going to be able, in the short time that we have, to do justice to his very complex theories. But for the purposes of this talk, he claims, in short, that the true self comes from being raised by what he calls a good enough parent who's not perfect, but who steps up to meet the basic requirements of the job. And somebody who grows up with this sort of parent grows up with a sense of the true self. That person has a sense of integrity, of authenticity. That person can successfully communicate his or her own needs. That person can feel empowered, can reach healthy coping mechanisms in life, can reach compromises when needed. And I would add, they can even live with being a good enough person, good enough to step up, and even if they can't do the job completely and perfectly, they can do a good enough job of it. And Winnicott contrasts this true self with what he calls a false self. And that comes, he claims, from living with a parent who's unreliable, and the child feels a constant need to appease this adult, in order to survive. And the false self often feels deeply unworthy, unempowered. And that person might be self-absorbed, but at the same time lacks a sense of self-competence, of motivation, lives with fear, with jealousy, of victimhood, and a constant need to comply with the wishes and expectations of outsiders. Okay, and this person might very well feel very much like the imposter of the imposter syndrome. And what I want to do with you in the short time that we have together is to consider the notion that the Israelites, who in fact we might argue suffer from a kind of abusive, traumatic, terrible parenting of sorts in Egypt by the enslaving Egyptians, they have a serious case of the false self and the related problem of imposter syndrome. And so we begin at the beginning. We start with Abraham, with Avraham, and he is the symbolic leader of a nation that hasn't been born yet. And we might say that the choice of Avraham comes along with God communicating, Avraham is going to be a person with a strong, true self. Lech lecha, right? That journey that you're going to go on is going to be a journey towards self-discovery, toward Abraham's most authentic self. As Abraham goes on this journey toward God, he's going to discover more and more about himself. And as a result, God says, God is going to make Abraham's name great. Va'agadla shemecha. And this notion of the name holds great importance in the Torah, especially in the book of Bereshit, where there are many long lists of genealogies, the names, these are the names. And according to the great philosopher Martin Buber, he claims that these names are an indication that these are people who are worthy these are people of substance, they're people of integrity, people who are worthy to leave an enduring legacy on earth. And significantly, Avraham is the descendant of a man in that genealogy whose very name is name. Ele toldot Shem, and Shem leads directly, the man whose name is name leads directly to Avraham, the man whose name is going to be recognized by God and made great by God. Okay, so Abraham's job as a symbolic leader of a nation that's in the making, hasn't been quite born yet, he's going to lay the groundwork for a later nation building effort. And that nation ultimately will live up to that name. It will build its collective name to the point that it will become empowered to fulfill its ultimate purpose. And we all know that the end of the verse of Lech Lecha is El Haaretz Asher Areka. To the land that I will show you. That full identity is going to come into fruition in the promised land, this collective version of the true self. Okay, but as we move forward, and we're going to go on a kind of sweeping journey here to follow what happens as the people move from the personal, from the symbolic to the collective, to the nation building effort, what's going to happen to this Lech Lecha? To the lecha, to the integrity, to the self, what's going to happen to that Shem, to that great name that Avraham builds. And along the way, we are going to consider the question that I hope many of you are have in the back of your heads. Where are the women in this search for self and for peoplehood? We can't help noticing that women are disturbingly absent in these lists of names, in these genealogies in the book of Bereshit. And so, we move ahead to the book of Shemot, which significantly begins with names. It's the book of names. Ve'ele Shemot b'nei Yisrael haba'im Mitzrayma. These are the names. And I think it's fair to say that we have great expectations in the book of names. It starts with great ceremony, with great promise. These are going to be, the people of name are going to create a nation of name. But very quickly, we are disappointed because the book of names quickly morphs into a book of the nameless, where the people are kind of moved into, there's this effort on the part of Paro and the Egyptian people to erase the true self, the true self of this guest nation. And the effort is going to be to make the people feel worthless, make them feel completely dependent on the whims of the enslaving nation. And they're going to very quickly move from the beginnings of this true self to a false self, where they feel that the only way that they can survive is to meet the demands of those enslavers who have total control over their lives. And I would argue that in many ways, the Egyptian effort evolves and succeeds. Quickly, individual names recede. Ultimately, they disappear. They're replaced by this kind of collective, almost amorphous sense of a whole, of just an indistinguishable mass of people, B'nai Yisrael. And the dehumanizing effort escalates. And here I would say, if you want to hear more about this or read more about this, may I suggest a book that I happen to have written called Subversive Sequels in the Bible, where I develop this in great detail, how this dehumanizing effort evolves. But I want to just pare it down to one really significant evocative word. And that's in this verse, where we're told, Uvnei Yisrael paru vayishritzu, vayirbu. And of course, we recognize these terms. The Israelites were fruitful and they multiplied. And these terms, I'm sure you're all thinking of it in your heads. These are reminiscent of the creation story in the book of Bereshit, where God says, "Pru or vu." The world is created, and in this great blessing, God says, "I want you to be fruitful and multiply." So we're recalling that original creation. But I'm sure you noticed in this presentation, there is a word that seems extremely dissonant in this phrase, in this little piece of the verse. Uvnei Yisrael paru vayishritzu vayirbu. This word is also a throwback to the creation story, but it is not a word that is used to present the blessed proliferation of humanity, but rather the introduction of the swamp creatures who are created from the water. Shirtzu haaretz, let these slimy creatures kind of come out from the swamp. And here I would argue that what we've got in this verse is a very subtle shift, very temporary and very subtle shift from the objective narration of the text to the subjective perception of the Egyptians as they are being whipped up into an anti-Israelite feeling by Paro, Vayishritzu. They're not looking at a blessed expansion of the people. They're looking at a kind of disgusting invasion, infestation even, of these swamp creatures, right? And we all know this unfortunately, from all kinds of racist propaganda films, how human beings, if there are many, many of them, in order to scare people and allow people to feel a sense of disgust toward that guest nation, these kinds of terms are invoked. And so here we have this Vayishritzu, and I would argue that this communicates to the people, both to the Egyptians, where they start to internalize that feeling toward their guests, who are initially welcome guests. Now they're nothing more than shratzim, and I would argue that ultimately, bit by bit, the Israelites begin to see themselves that way as well. They lose their sense of worth, they lose their sense of self. And they see themselves existing only to please the people and to survive from one day to the next. Okay, so things take a terribly negative turn, and it seems that all is lost. But suddenly we have a bit of a reversal here, and here we have this verse out of the gloom and the doom, the return of named individuals in a very surprising way. Two people of name, where suddenly we're told. Vayomer melech Mitzrayim lamiyaldot ha'ivriot asher shem ha'achat Shifra v'shem ha'sheni Pu'ah. These two women, these two midwives, and for no apparent reason, the text seems insistent on naming them. The name of the first is Shifra, the name of the second is Pu'ah. And these two women actually do prove to be people who are very much worthy of a name. They recall the story of Abraham. Okay, we didn't touch on this, but Abraham ha'ivri, they are called ivriot. They are other, as he was, people who stand up for their own principles. Just as Abraham is called a Yirei Elohim, God-fearing, they stand up by Tir'ena hamiyaldot et ha'Elohim. They fear God, even though God has not even been present in this chapter. They step up, they find their way to God, they find their way to morality, and they actually, through just the courage of their convictions, actually score an incredible victory over this all-powerful king of Egypt. He has to back down from his genocidal order. He wants them to quietly kill the Hebrew babies, only the boys, let's keep in mind. And what we find in his desperation, when that fails, he's basically bested by these women, he says, okay, I couldn't do this through the agency of these midwives. I have to now turn to the entire people. And here, Vayitzav Paro L'chol Amo, all of his people, Lemor, he has to sort of come out of the shadows now and say this in a somewhat more public way. He commands his entire nation, Kol haben hayilod hayeora tashlichuhu v'kol habat tichayu. Through all baby boys who are born, cast them into the Nile, but let the daughters live. Okay, and this is initially somewhat puzzling. If he's going to kill the babies, why not just kill all the babies? But we get the sense that he's saying, well, yes, I happen to be a genocidal a maniac, but I won't kill unnecessarily. These little girls are not going to bother me, right? What's the real fear? The fear is the baby boys who are going to grow up to be strong soldiers who might pose a threat to me at some point. The girls, let them live. What do I care? And what we have immediately following this is one of the most beautiful ironies of the early chapters of the book of Shemot, where he says, he barely gets the words out of his mouth, V'chol habat techayun, let these daughters live because they are no threat to me, where we have a series of banot, of truly remarkable daughters, and that's how they're referred to. And I would say these are the ideological heirs of these midwives, people who step up, find their true selves, find their names, and they push back, starting with Vayelech ish me beit Levi vayikach et bat Levi, the daughter of Levi, who will in fact be named later as Yocheved, but significantly she is presented at first as a bat. The text wants to really hammer home this great irony. The first daughter is the daughter of Levi. The second daughter, not here on your screen, but the bat of the bat, even though she's not explicitly called that. The daughter of this daughter is going to be Miriam. And the most surprising bat of all, of course, is Bat Paro, the daughter of the genocidal king himself, who is going to find, if I dare say, her inner Ivri, her inner true self, and says, I'm joining this team. These are the people who stand up for what's right, who don't just go along with things to please a tyrant. They do what's right because it's right, because they have a sense of who they are. All right, so what we've got here is a story of several truly remarkable women who push back and seem to pull the nation out of their sense of hopelessness, out of their sense of worthlessness, and to recover some of the sense of the name and of the self. The question, of course, is, can it last, right? Is this going to be enough? And sadly, it is not. Okay, and here almost immediately afterwards, well, not immediately, we have the miraculous salvation of the people, the redemption of the people, the splitting of the sea, bombastic miracles. And you would think that should be enough for the people to buy into this thing and say, we're going with God from now on. We're heading right wherever God leads us till we get to the promised land. El haaretz asher areka, we're ready. But instead, what we get is this very surprising piece of text, which is in the 13th chapter of the book of Shemot. Vayhi b'shalach Paro et ha'am. Paro released the nation. God doesn't let them go the most direct route. Why not? Because God says, Pen yinachem ha'am biratam milchama v'shavu mitzrayma. As soon as these people get the first glimpse of war, they're going to panic and they're going to insist on going back to Egypt. Now, this is truly, I would say, not only shocking, it's absolutely baffling. How can it be that people who they barely dusted themselves the mud off of from walking across a split sea, right? The lashes on their backs have barely healed, and here God knows that as soon as they see the first challenge, they're going to go running back into the arms of their tyrannizers, of their oppressors. How can this be? And what I would like to argue is that what this is the resurgence of the inner sheretz, right? You can redeem people physically, but redeeming them emotionally, psychologically, spiritually is a much, much greater task. And it seems from this, not just this text, but in several other texts that we're about to study, that this is something that will be very difficult for the people to part with. This sense of, I am unworthy, I cannot step up and embrace my freedom. So much so that what they're starting to fear now is freedom itself, even more than oppression. Oppression is preferable to this freedom that they have been offered. And here I want to just check in with the thoughts of another great 20th century psychologist, Erich Fromm. And he actually wrote an entire book called Escape from Freedom, which sounds very counterintuitive. We would think that we would escape toward freedom, but actually one of the things that seems to terrify us the most is freedom. And he says this: the frightened individual cannot bear to be his own individual self any longer. He tries frantically to get rid of it, to feel security again by the elimination of this burden, the self. Modern man is anxious and tempted to surrender his freedom to dictators of all kinds. What are these dictators? All right, if you'll just allow me my own little riff on what I think is the 21st century version of this, right? This need to get rid of the burden of self that's weighing so heavily on us. What are our dictators today? First of all, the caveat: we all have very good reasons today to be anxious. It seems that increasingly the world is just spinning out of control. We're reaching alarming levels. And I speak as a resident in the beloved land of Israel, where we are facing many, many challenges. And I know that Jews throughout the world are as well. Divisiveness, violence, corruption, difficulty everywhere, anti-Semitism, and certainly our beloved Israel is no exception. And so it's very understandable that we often feel a sense of a lack of control. We feel that we're not just incapable, but in some sense, maybe even unworthy of managing our own fate. And as Fromm argues, we have this desperate need to escape from it. Some people just stop watching the news. I tried it, but I couldn't keep it up. But I would say the most available form of escape today, no judgment from me, we all need it, but screens of all sorts, right? At the touch of a button, we can just lose ourselves in a video on any size screen, just carry us away to some imaginary world. Social media often gives us, engenders a feeling, sometimes a false feeling of vast social connections, even if they aren't actually real, and sometimes just general phone fidgeting. But I think it tends to soothe us to feel that we're embraced, we're transported to the point that we don't actually have to be in charge. And I think at the very core of that is a feeling of unworthiness, of being incapable. Sadly, of course, as studies have shown, we often, ironically, this kind of escape seems to be making matters worse. This is actually hazardous to our feelings of well-being, that excessive use of social media actually can increase feelings of isolation, of detachment, of low self-worth, where it looks like everybody else, right? These airbrushed versions of people who are just, they're beautiful. They're all having the perfect vacation with their perfect family with no problems. Basically, I think it increases the sense of imposter syndrome. Everybody else is the real thing. I'm the only one who's not holding up my piece. Anyways, okay. Let's get back to the people in the desert. God recognizes the people's desperate, deeply human tendency to escape their unworthy selves and return to the perceived safety of their known dictator, which is Egypt. And so God gives them distance and God gives them time. God says, I'm going to have you walk around this desert. Maybe that experience will help build you up so that you'll be ready to feel worthy of the land, to step up and step into the land. And here is a spoiler alert. It's not going to work. And here comes one of the two main passages that I'd like to study with you in the short time that we have. This is from the book of Bamidbar. In the 13th chapter, it's the story of the Meraglim, of the spies. We just read it recently on Shabbat, on a recent Shabbat, where Moshe sends scouts to pave the way. It's time to go into the land. It's time to step up and own it. And Moshe sends these scouts to come back and bring word of the land. Okay, let's look at it together. I'm going to look at my sources. I have it all for you here on the screen. If you want to follow it in English, I have it on the next slide, but I can't show them both simultaneously. So if you need it and you have a Tanakh with the English available, I would suggest that you look at that as we read. Okay, so God speaks to Moshe and says, and as we're reading, I'd like to challenge everyone to think about what kind of character sketch we would draw of these Meraglim. Who are these people? God says to Moshe, Shlach lecha anashim send men. Viaturu et Eretz Canaan, right? They're going to scout out the land. And first he's told, Ish echad, one man. Seems to be like highly individualized, each one. How else are they described? Kol nasi vahem. These are the leaders. These are the princes, the heads, the chieftains of the people. And Moshe sends them, kulam anashim. Now they're described as Rashi B'nai Yisrael. They are the heads of the people. Ve'ele shimotam. These are their names. And this formula sends us back to the beginning of the book of Shemot, where we are kind of primed for people who are worthy of a name. These are their names, and we have a long list of all the names. And then yet again, Eile Shemot HaAnashim, these are the names of the people. Okay, so we're primed for people who are upstanding, who are strong individuals, who are worthy of leadership of the people. Okay, we would expect great things from such people. And I might argue that one of the things that we might very reasonably expect from such people is that if you send out 12 of them, right, if you have one representative from each tribe, how many reports, how many different kinds of reports should we get? Okay, insert Jewish joke here, 12 Jews, 15 opinions. I don't know exactly what the number is, but I would imagine it's more than 2. What we're going to find is that there's this one block of response by 10 of them, and then 2, a mere 2 who are going to dissent. All right, so keep that in mind. And let's now look at the report that they bring. I'm sorry, just Moshe tells them, Uritem et haaretz mahi, see the land, what does it look like? And then what they do is they go into the land, they cut down these clusters of grapes, and they carry them with a big stick, right? I'm sure you've all seen these wonderful pictures by the Israeli Tourism Ministry, these oversized grapes. Okay, and they now come back and they show these enormous fruits to the people. And then they tell them, Vayisapru lo vayamru, right? Banu el haaretz, and they say, we came to the land. Hold on a second, I'm just having trouble seeing that. Let me move. Nah, can't do it. So, okay, we came to the land that you sent us to. V'gam zavat chalav u'devashi v'zeh pirya. Yes, indeed, it is a land flowing with milk and honey. Ephes ki az ha'am hayoshev ba'aretz. Ephes, and I remember the first time I really studied this in depth was with my teacher of blessed memory, Nechama Leibovitz, and she made a big deal out of this Ephes, which really changes the entire tone of everything that they say, this little, however. Ki az ha'am, the nation is strong. The cities are fortified. V'gam yilidei ha'anak, there are the offspring of giants there. Amalek is to the south. Okay, and then so their report, even though they were sent there as leaders of the people, as people who are very capable, the report that they bring back, right, Shemotam, the Shemot, the names, the Nesi'im, the leaders, but they come back with this. Everything about them, and I would challenge you, if we to come up with one emotion that these upstanding leaders of the people, one emotion that they are evoking when they come back with their report, I would say that the one emotion that they're stirring up is nothing less than fear, panic, terror. What is it? Everything is frightening, right? They go into the land to do a job, and they come back and they say, first of all, what are they afraid of? They're afraid of the inhabitants. The inhabitants are huge. Ephes ki az ha'am. They are yilidei ha'anak. If they're going to mention one nation, it's going to be Amalek, who is known as this fierce enemy of the people, right? What else are they afraid of? They evoke fear of the land itself. Eretz zavat chalav, those huge overgrown grapes could have been a sign of great bounty, but instead they present that as a sign of something to be feared. If the land can produce fruit of this size, imagine how much damage that land can cause to us. Not only that, Eretz zavat chalav udvash, a land flowing with milk and honey, is a land that can easily, beautifully feed its people And somehow they turn that into Eretz Ochelet Yoshveha, as we read on. It's not a land that feeds its people. It's actually a land that eats its people. It consumes its people. So they bring out fear of the inhabitants of the land, of the people who live in the land, and then it escalates. What else? What other fear do we see here? Notice how they speak in one voice. Vayomru, vayisapru, this collective voice that doesn't distinguish. There are no dissenters. It feels like there's this kind of mob mentality that is taken over. Everything they do as one. There's a fear, I would say, of one another, right? Dare I say something that varies in any way from what the mob has decided, from the tone and the content of what we are delivering here. And I would argue that the people pick up on this. And if you see back here in the story, when they respond as one, as kol ha'eda. Where is it? Sorry. Yeah, here it is. Kol ha'eda. When they respond as one. They get this sense that the leaders are one mob, and the people themselves are a mob of one. It's just these singular voices that don't allow for anyone to say anything else. But I would say, of all the fears that they bring out here, the greatest of all is this one. And here I would say this is nothing less than an overt case of imposter syndrome in the desert. They say this unbelievably revealing statement, Vanihi be'einenu kachagavim, v'chein hayinu be'einehem. We were in our own eyes as grasshoppers, and so we were in their eyes. They tell us first how they see themselves. They see themselves as nothing more than insects. And looking at this, how could we not be reminded of those swamp creatures back in the beginning of the story of the enslavement, this Vayishritzu? Here we've got that Vayishritzu mentality that is alive and well at this really, really important turning point, what should have been a turning point for them to rise up and go into the land. Instead, they're seeing themselves as small, and they're sure that because they see themselves that way, they can't imagine that anyone else sees them any different, as any bigger than that. And so they say, in this act of just overt projection, certainly that's how they saw us as well. Right, so this is the story. These people simply cannot move forward. And then their response, and this gets us back to Beshalach, their go-to response is Nitna Rosh v'nashuva Mitzrayma. Every time they feel overwhelmed with fear, their one response is, let's go back to our dictator. We cannot govern ourselves. We're afraid to step up and do anything on our own. Let's go back to the tyrant. At least there, somebody else was taking care of us. Ourselves belong to someone else. We don't have to deal with that. Nitna Rosh, let us literally give, but it means to appoint a head, a leader. And here's an irony that the Rashi B'nai Yisrael these leaders are replaced by what they want instead is a Rosh, is a leader who's going to bring them right back to Egypt. God is going to then deliver a very harsh punishment to Kol Ha'eda, again, this collective, these people who speak in one voice, who are saying, we can't do it, we're incapable. And God says this Eda, this Kol Ha'eda, simply cannot be the generation that can embrace the challenge of creating an autonomous nation in their own land. These people simply can't. And it's, although on the face of it, what God is saying is this is a punishment from on high, it seems to me that really what's being communicated here is it's just a natural consequence. You can't do it. You're not capable of it. So you people have to die here in the desert. It's only the next generation that will have the possibility of feeling their own sense of worth. And so those will be the people who will actually finish the job. El ha'aretz asher areka. Okay, so that's the end of the story. And now what I want to get to is back to one of the questions that we posed at the very beginning. Where are the women? And I would argue that just as we saw in the story of Shemot, the early chapters of the book of Shemot, where we have the names of the people, we have the beginning of nation building, and then we have the breakdown of that effort. I think we see it here as well. We have women who suddenly step up and pull the narrative back in the direction in which it needs to go. And here we have this really remarkable passage that is remarkable in many ways, including the fact that it is almost always overlooked. The story of the daughters of Zelophehad appears in the 27th chapter of the book of Bamidbar. But in the 26th chapter of the book of Bamidbar, we have this beautiful little passage that I like to call two things. One, I would call it an ode to women, and the other, I would call it an overture to the symphony. If the symphony is the story of the daughters of Zelophehad, this is a kind of overture that gets us in the kind of mindset, in the mood to see what's going to happen with this great empowering act on the part of women. And here, if you look at the passage on the screen, what we have here is a long set of genealogies. And what is very unusual about this genealogy is that two words keep on kind of jumping off the page. One is the word Shem, the name. The word name, Shem or Shemot, in this chapter is used to refer only to women, and in a very unexpected way. Women who we've already met before somehow need to be named again. Who is named? Yocheved, Shem Eshet Amram Yocheved Bat Levi, Shem Bat Asher, Shem Benot Zelophehad. The names are repeated here again, and there is this wonderful midrash that connects this. These are the names of his daughters, and above it says the names of the daughters of Zelophehad. They had a name in merit and a name in action. So is the case in Shemot 1, the name of, and here this actually draws this back to the Shemot, Shem Ha'achat Shifra, V'Shem Hashenit Pua. The Midrash sees a kind of, I don't know if you want to call it a psychic connection of sorts, between the Banot in the story of Benot Zelophehad, and I would argue even in the overture to that story, getting us ready for that. And notice here the daughters that are invoked here are not just the Benot Zelophehad, but those very daughters like Yocheved and Miriam, who are mentioned back in the story, who overturned Paro's decree of V'chol Habat Techayun. We've got an extension of Banot who are still on the path of overturning Paro's effort to destroy these people, to destroy them from the inside out. And here these women pick up that effort after there have been many declines in the effort, and they are helping to bring it back up again. So it starts with the names, with the repetition of bat, and bat. And then we have this wonderfully evocative little phrase at the end of this passage, Velo notar mehem ish. We have this little recap of the story of the Meraglim and the fact that the entire generation dies in the desert, but it ends with the words, Velo notar mehem ish, ki im Kalev ben Yefuneh v'Yoshua bin Nun. Not one man remained of them, except for Kalev and Yoshua. And here the Midrash looks at this. This is just too good to pass up. Not one man remained, a man, but not a woman. Ish velo isha, in that they did not want to enter the land. They meaning the men in the story of the Meraglim. But the women drew near to request an inheritance of the land. That is why this passage follows that of the death of the desert generation. Ish velo isha. Basically, this passage is getting us ready for the women who are going to overturn this negative interlude between the two brackets of the story of these heroic banot. Basically, continuing that story and overturning the story of the Meraglim. The story of the Meraglim in its core is a story about God saying, it's time for you to feel your worth and embrace the land and inherit it. And the people are seized with fear. They give in to terror and they say, we don't want it. We can't do it. We're unworthy of it. We refuse the land. Right? They're offered it and they refuse it because of fear. And what we're going to find in the story, the remarkable story of the Banot Zelophehad, they are denied the land and they're going to find the courage to say, we demand it. It's a beautiful reversal of the entire sense of the story. All right, so now we're finally ready to look at this thing. The story of the Benot Zelophehad. It's hard for me to see it on the screen. I'm going to look at it on my page. We start with Vatikravna Benot Zelophehad, right? These women came close. Ve'ele Shemot Benotav. Here we have again a repetition of Ve'ele Shemot. And the names again, even though these women were named one after another, one chapter, a mere one chapter earlier, they are named again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. And what do? Vata'amodna, wonderful word. They feminine plural. They stood up. Lifnei Moshe, v'lifnei Elazar HaKohen, v'lifnei HaNesiim, v'chol ha'edah, petach ohel moed. Okay, so they stand up. And here, if the overwhelming sentiment in the story of the Meraglim is fear, I would argue that the overwhelming sentiment in the story of the daughters of Zelophehad is fearlessness, right? This is the fearlessness of the midwives. Vata'amodna, what a powerful word. They stand up, like literally and figuratively. They take a stand. They tap into their deepest, truest selves. There's no sense of dependence. And here they stand up to all symbols of power. And if you try to imagine what this must have looked like, how really terrifying this must have been. They stand up to all, right, the religious, political authority figures, Moshe, Elazar HaKohen, the Nesiim, the chieftains, the political heads. And here I think it's the Nesiim is a wink back to the story of the Meraglim, Kol Nasi Bahem. Remember, those Nesiim were on the wrong side of this. They succumbed to the fear. And now these women are standing before them, opposite them, right? Telling them, we don't accept what you said. The Nesiim can be wrong sometimes. We have a different way of looking at this. Not only that, they stand lifnei kol ha'edah. Remember, that was the term that was used consistently to refer to this univocal mob, kol ha'edah. And here you have the Benot Zelophehad who stand opposite them and say, I'm going to stand up to you. We have a different view of this thing. Not only this, they stand in the very symbol of religious authority, petach ohel moed, almost like, please forgive me, it's in front of the Vatican. Like, imagine just like the most spectacular, most awe-inspiring religious spot, petach ohel moed. These 5 women step up to that space and they make their claim. They say their father died in the desert. They make sure to tell us that Edah, that monolithic Edah, our father was not part of that. And I find this almost amusing. What they're telling us is, Ki bechet omet, yes, our father was a sinner and he died for his sin, but he was an individual even in his sin. He died alone. He wasn't part of a mob scene, right? But he didn't have any children, any sons. Why should our father's name? Here are these women of name who are standing up to uphold the name of their father, right? This is of great significance to them. And they say, Tina lanu achuza, give us an inheritance. And here again, we have this wonderful reversal of what the Meraglim had said, Tina nitina rosh v'nashuva. Give, right? What do they want? What do they want Moshe to give? Appoint or the people to appoint a head so that we can go run back into the arms of our oppressors. And here are these women who are saying, we utterly reject that oppression. We have moved beyond it. What we demand, what we need to be given is an inheritance, is a foothold in this land. And Moshe, of course, as is well known, accepts their argument. This is one of the several cases where Moshe doesn't know what the law is, and has to go to seek counsel with God. And God's response is, using their wonderful word, Tina lanu achuza, God gives us emphatic response, naton titeh. That's what they want me to give them. you must absolutely give that to them. All right, so basically we've got this kind of recovery of the true selves, getting back on track to the beginning of Lech Lecha, El Haaretz Asher Areka. I would say at long last saying, now we are ready. At least the five of us are ready. These women are ready. The men of the next generation will be ready. But we are able to embrace that proud name and build a nation that is going to be able to fulfill its true self in all kinds of new ways, which will happen in the autonomous land of Israel. Okay, just to say a personal word, I've had the privilege of living in Israel for, the biblical number 40, even just slightly over that in this wonderfully yearned for land. And as I mentioned earlier, this land of ours is undergoing quite a few challenges. In addition to the threats that are coming from without, from Iran and all the proxies and terror and all the terrible things that are going on, arguably worse than any of this is these unprecedented levels of internal divisiveness. And if you're anything like me, sometimes you feel at a loss, you feel stymied, overwhelmed. You wonder, what could one unempowered, we might even say, what one unworthy imposter possibly do about any of this? To me, this wonderful word, vata'amodna, carries enormous resonance. This courage that it starts with an act of standing up, right? These women could not know where that act would lead, how much it would matter, but they felt, right, the sense of true self enough to say, I'm going to start this action. I don't know what might happen to it, but I'm good enough to take that first move. And I would argue that even though, as we all know later, some of what they accomplish is mitigated, and that comes at the end of the book of Bimidbar, and that you can see that inside the text. But I would add that there is great lasting significance to what these women do. First of all, one of the things they do is succeed in changing the mindset regarding the land from one of negativity and unempowerment to a feeling of that is ours and we want to claim it. And in addition, I would say that these women provide incredible inspiration and a foundation for the notion of creating new laws that take women's legitimate claims into account. And we are living in a time where we are seeing some continuing, surprising, and blessed manifestations of what was begun by the daughters of Zelophehad. So even if the results are not always perfect, that first act of standing up can have great results. I think of another great woman in Tanakh who stands up. There too, we have a woman who we might argue is suffering from a bit of imposter syndrome, Esther, where she says, I can't go to the king, I can't plead for the people. And Mordechai gives her this wonderful pep talk. And almost immediately afterwards, we have Vata'amod b'chatzar beit hamelech. She stands up. And again, she can't know where that's going to lead, but she's able to take that first step. And of course, her ancestor Shaul is given that same message. You might feel small, but you have to feel that even that small sense of empowerment, you're good enough to make something happen. Anyway, just to get back to the difficult situation that we, the Jews, and we, the world, are finding ourselves into these days, I think it's worth recalling all of this, that even if we feel unworthy of stepping up, wallowing in these feelings is a luxury that we simply can't afford. If each of us can be good enough to get over our smallness, we might be surprised by the positive ripples that could help bring healing to, or maybe just get us a step closer toward bringing healing to our beloved land. And I want to end, I'll leave some time for questions, but I want to end with the words of a British author named Neil Gaiman, who I think summed things up very well. Here is Neil Gaiman. And he tells this little story about a chance encounter with another person who shares his name, Neil, his first name, Neil. And here's what he says. Some years ago, I was lucky enough to be invited to a gathering of artists and scientists, writers and discoverers of things. And I felt that at any moment they would realize that I didn't qualify to be there among these people who had really done things. On my second or third night there, I was standing at the back of the hall, and I started talking to a very nice, polite, elderly gentleman about several things, including our shared first name. And then he pointed to the hall of people and said words to the effect of, I just look at all these people and I think, what the heck am I doing here? They've made amazing things. I just went where I was sent. And I said, yes, but you were the first man on the moon. I think that counts for something. And I felt a bit better, because if Neil Armstrong felt like an imposter, maybe everyone did. Maybe there weren't any grown-ups, only people who had worked hard and were slightly out of their depth, all of us doing the best job we could, which is all we can really hope for. That's all. I'm done. I would like to open this. If you would like to unmute yourselves, we've got a couple minutes. Questions, comments. Floor is open.
Hi, can I make a couple of comments? Hi, Judy. It's
Sure.
Siva
Hi.
Hertzberg is my name.
Okay.
Hi.
Hi, I see you. Yes.
Thank you. This was wonderful.
Thank you.
I have two comments. One is the on the Vayishritzu, when you were describing the dehumanization in terms of that term reflecting in the feelings of the Mitzrim and Bnei Israel. It reminded me so much of the Nazis and their depiction of Jews as rats, and how that impacted the Nazi mentality and the Jewish mentality. So
true.
similar.
Those propaganda reels with interspersing swarming rodents with Jews.
Yeah,
absolutely. So
you
can really feel it. Yeah, thank you. Yes.
There was one other thing I wanted to say. I don't know if anybody else on this class was in the last class that we took a class with Rabbi Yitzchak Blau about the sins of fathers impacting the children, whether children can be punished for the sins of their fathers. And here you gave us this a true example of the daughters of Zelophehad saying that our father was a sinner, and the text actually uses the exact same words. It said, "Ki b'chet o mate," that he died for his own sin, and we don't want to be punished. We don't deserve to be punished. We're going to stand up against that, so that we receive the land, and we're not affected by the sin of our father. So it's
Beautiful.
A perfect example.
Look at that intersectional learning. How great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, Susanna.
Yeah, you mentioned that only people who have names speak with God. And this isn't exactly the same, but Manoach's wife, I mean, she's not named. She doesn't speak to God, but she does speak to Isha Elohim, whereas her husband, who has a name, doesn't.
Very true. Very true. I have actually written about this. It's such a rich chapter where the woman is the one who is enlightened, who is in tune with the divine voice, and the man is hopelessly obtuse, doesn't get any of it.
Is that in your book or somewhere else?
Yes. I wrote it's in my book. It's in chapter 6, I think. And of course, the question arises: well, if she's such a remarkable woman, where's her name? And I offer there something that I kind of, with a caveat that I'm not sure I actually buy this, but there is something to the fact that the text has to continually refer to her as Ha'isha. All these things that are happening that formerly were the purview only of the men in the text, right? It's taking the stories of Bereshit, where the infertile woman, where the angel or God comes to speak to the man, and the man either does or does not inform his wife. And here it's completely turned on its head, where the God speaks to the woman, and the man has to come like scampering up saying, please tell me what happens. And then he still doesn't understand what's going on. And there's something about the way that the text keeps on saying, the man of God said to the woman, that if the name had been there, you might have missed that really strong irony, but I'm not sure I believe what I just said. So, with all due caveats, thank you. Yeah. Any other questions? If not, I thank you, and I send you on to your next class so that you could tie in what we just did with whatever happens there. Batzlacha, everybody.
Thank you very much.
See you. Bye-bye.